Hello and welcome to the Data Engineering Podcast, the show about modern data management. What are the pieces of advice that you wish you had received early in your career of data engineering? If you hand a book to a new data engineer, what wisdom would you add to it? I'm working with O'Reilly on a project to collect the 97 things that every data engineer should know, and I need your help. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/97things to add your voice and share your hard-earned expertise. And when you're ready to build your next pipeline or want to test out the projects you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so check out our friends over at Linode. With their managed Kubernetes platform, it's now even easier to deploy and scale your workflows, or try out the latest Helm charts from tools like Pulsar, Pachyderm, and Dagster. With simple pricing, fast networking, object storage, and worldwide data centers, you've got everything you need to run a bulletproof data platform. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Linode, that's Linode, today and get a $60 credit to try out a Kubernetes cluster of your own. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Your host is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Douwe Maan about Meltano, an open source platform for building, running, and orchestrating ELT pipelines. So, Douwe, can you start by introducing yourself?
Yes, of course. First of all, thanks for having me, Tobias. So my name is Douwe Maan, like you mentioned, and I work at GitLab. I've been at GitLab for a little bit over 5 years now. I originally joined as a developer, then I became development lead, which turned into the engineering management role over at some point. And then about 9 months ago, 4 years into my time at GitLab, I moved over to the Meltano project. And Meltano, of course, is what I'm here to talk about today.
And do you remember how you first got involved in the area of data management?
Yeah, so really 9 months ago when I got into the Meltano team is when I got involved in the area of data management. Like I mentioned, my background is in software engineering. I joined GitLab as a developer 5 years ago, and I got into development engineering management. And a year ago or so, the Meltano team at GitLab was in need of an engineering manager. And at that point, having seen GitLab grow from 10 people to about 1,000, I was kind of starting to feel that itch of wanting to work on a new project again and maybe something smaller. So when the Meltano opportunity came around within GitLab, I didn't hesitate and I grabbed it. So I've only been involved in anything related to the data space for about 9 months or so. Before that, of course, I knew about data management, but I've really only started to read up and become an expert recently.
Given that you're so new to this area, what are some of the aspects of the learning curve that you've been running into as you get ramped up on the project, and the use case that it fills, and some of the challenges within the overall ecosystem that you're trying to tackle?
Yeah, great question. So it's interesting in a way, because I joined the Meltano team back in September of last year, but it wasn't really until March of this year that I actually started digging into, data engineering, data management, as you call it, and the tools that are available in this space and the problems that they mean to solve. When I came on board to the Meltano project, it had already been around for about a year and a half inside GitLab. So we had a pretty clear idea of what the tool is that we were trying to build. And I was really just approaching it as a developer building that tool based on the roadmap that we had laid out ourselves. As I've becoming, up to speed on the data space and what kind of tooling is available here, and then the role that Meltano might fill in the space, and how that relates to, what we originally set out to do 2 years ago, and where our opportunities lie today. The learning curve had actually been less steep than I thought it would be, because I've had the opportunity to talk with a lot of really great people from the data scene who I've met and been introduced through to channels like Locally Optimistic on Slack, and also the Singer and DBT ecosystems have a lot of really great people in them who have been able to basically kind of point me in all the right directions I wouldn't at all call myself an expert on data management in general, but I am a little bit of an expert now on specifically the open source ELT field, in large part because of this is what I've learned from these people. And through that information, I've actually been pleasantly surprised by the amount of material that is available online and in written about how all of this fits together. So the learning curve hasn't been as steep as I expected, actually.
And given that you are still new to it and you still have sort of the beginner mindset as it pertains specifically to data management and ELT, what are some of the benefits that you see that providing as somebody who is taking on the project lead role of Meltano?
Yeah, I think one thing that makes a difference is that my background is very much in software engineering. So that means that, especially coming out of GitLab, which is of course an end-to-end platform for the entire DevOps lifecycle, it means that from the get-go, I am approaching data engineering and this entire topic with this software development and DevOps mindset, and I kind of come into it expecting all of the benefits that best practices of DevOps like code review, continuous integration and delivery, and version control in general provide. So it means that while historically it looks like a lot of data engineering and ELT pipelines have been implemented and realized through more visual tools, Informatica is one that of course is a big name, even though today it might no longer be the go-to modern tool. But it means that in trying to build Meltano, making it fit into the DevOps lifecycle of it's just another software engineering project with people interacting through version control and code review, to me is a given. And it means that in figuring out how to build a data engineering or ELT tool, these are kind of fundamentals from the beginning instead of something that I had to learn over time. So I think one advantage of my being a software engineer by trade who is now getting into data engineering instead of the opposite, which is of course what you see in a lot of other data engineering tools out there, means that what people who are looking for some of these software engineering and DevOps benefits, what they will find in Meltano will probably be closer to what a traditional software engineering project might look like compared to people who are only just getting into that or trying to learn it. So from the get-go, if you start working with Meltano, we will expect you to be comfortable with topics like version control, continuous integration and deployment, and code review and the like, because we think that these are a core part of what makes Meltano and similar tools, what they bring to a team that it might not have today, where a lot of that extra value actually comes from, if you're looking at it from a collaboration and ultimately efficiency and output perspective. So in that sense, my being a novice and really having to hear from experienced data engineers what it is that they would like a tool like Meltano to do, with me then kind of figuring out, okay, how do we fit that into this DevOps approach to data engineering? It's been really valuable that I don't have too many preconceived notions of what an ELT pipeline looks like. And that's also why, and you'll see this later on in the call too, one of the main things that I'm actually looking for in terms of contribution to Meltano right now is just in the form of feedback by experienced people with data engineering in general and open source data engineering around Singer taps and targets in particular, but we'll get to those in a second, I'm sure.
And digging deeper into Meltano itself, can you give a description about what it is and some of the story behind it? And I know that you recently pivoted in terms of the main focus behind it, so if you can give a bit of context there as well.
Absolutely, my pleasure. So like you mentioned, actually, today Meltano is explicitly an open source platform for building, running, and orchestrating ELT pipelines. And in a moment, I'll clarify, because these ELT pipelines are specifically ELT pipelines built out of Singer taps and targets for the extraction and loading bit, and then DBT models for the transformation bit. But originally, when Meltano was founded 2 years ago within GitLab, this was only a part of what we wanted to realize with Meltano. So 2 years ago or so, in the summer of 2018, the GitLab data team was scaling up, ramping up. GitLab as a whole was growing, and we realized we needed to do more with the data that we were gathering. So we started to build our data team and put together our data stack. And coming from the open source background, GitLab itself being an open source project originally, and even today being an open core product where a really large amount of our engineering time every day actually goes into the open source version, which is freely available to all rather than a proprietary edition that we make money on. We started looking for open source tooling first before we checked out some of the more popular proprietary and paid tools. We wanted to see if it was possible to build a full data stack with everything our data engineers, analytics engineers, as well as analysts and data scientists would need, just out of open source tooling. So what we found is that a lot of this open source tooling already did exist, and if you went through the trouble of actually tying all of these components together, you could build a pretty robust data integration pipeline out of only open source components. But we also realized that the glue in between these different components, so you got to think of the extractor, the loader, the transformations themselves, but also the orchestration, which manages running this on a schedule and then making sure it keeps running reliably and that we will be notified if it fails. We recognized that between a lot of these open source tools that existed, this glue hadn't necessarily been filled in, or at least not been, there wasn't an open source tool available that you could really just get started with and 10 minutes later see your data flow from the data source to the data warehouse, and then also have the opportunity to actually start analyzing it. So what we realized is that there would be value in us building the tooling to glue together these various open source components. So Meltano was founded in GitLab with the idea being, well, we want this ourselves, let's build it, and let's also build it open source for the wider community. Relatively quickly, though, we came to the conclusion that Meltano's the pace of development of Meltano was not able to keep up with the growing needs of the actual GitLab data team that was set to use this Meltano project. And this had to do with the fact that, of course, we wanted to extract data from various data sources, SaaS APIs and data formats, and load it into a data warehouse. But we realized that if we were going to have to write and maintain these data extractors ourselves, this would take a lot of time and a lot of effort that at that point might be better spent on actually, getting something out of that data, and we might be better off going with a proprietary tool for the moment. But being GitLab, we still very much believed that this should all be possible with open source tooling. So the Meltano project stuck around, even though the GitLab data team at the time was no longer actually using it. And since with GitLab, we had found quite some success in offering a full tool for the DevOps lifecycle to an entire engineering team, doing everything from version control, issue tracking, CI/CD, and some amount of tooling around security checking as well. We thought that there was a place in the open source space for a similar tool for the data lifecycle. Again, the idea being that composed of various open source components, you could spin up this tool called Meltano and immediately have a kind of a starting point for your entire data team to have a single source of truth for what their data pipelines and their data strategy looks like, not just from the data integration perspective, like how do you get it from the sources to the warehouse, but also what do you do with that data next, where of course you start looking into analytics or BI software, notebooking with Jupyter or other data science practices that ultimately all connect with that data warehouse. So that's where Meltano started, with this kind of end-to-end vision. We want to build a tool that does this all because we saw value there with GitLab as well. But then over the last 2 years, it became clear that this end-to-end vision, while it resonated with other people and data teams out there, we hadn't necessarily been able to actually attract teams that were at that point willing to start evaluating it internally, or were actually able to start contributing to it to make this vision a reality with us. So 2 months ago, back in March, I really started looking into, okay, we've built something pretty cool now and it does actually work. You can use Meltano for the end-to-end data lifecycle. So it can do everything from data integration to data transformation. And it had some basic point and click and analytics functionality built in as well, with a modeling language inspired by LookML that allows you to basically describe the schema in the data warehouse and then describe how these various tables relate to each other and can be joined, so that you can then use the Meltano interface to kind of point and click and get some simple dashboards and reports out of that. But we realized that this future where an entire team would be able to use Meltano and I don't want to say and nothing else, because we recognize that on any of these kind of steps in the life cycle, specific teams or people might have bigger needs that go beyond what Meltano is able to deliver today or ever. And we are, Meltano is not too opinionated about whether or not you use all of its part, or whether you kind of pick and choose and decide to swap certain things out for possibly a proprietary tool or some other open source tool. But we realized that the story of Meltano and a team actually deploying it would still depend on that entire team, of course, being convinced of the extra value they would get out of using Meltano compared to what they are using today. And then if we wanted this team to actually contribute and help us make this a reality, that also means that this team would need to be pretty technical, or at least comfortable contributing to Python projects, and not just the Meltano project itself, but also these specific extractors and loaders for all of the various data sources and data warehouses. So we came to the conclusion that with this end-to-end vision, we were not actually able to get the people excited that we needed to get excited to make this a reality with us. Because if you want to convince an entire team of the value of this integrated tool, then it basically already needs to have reached a level of quality in each of the various steps that make up that life cycle. And ultimately, the person getting most value out of any data project is, of course, the people doing the insights, getting the insights at the end, the people doing the analysis or running the notebook projects against it, for example. And these are not always the same people who are actually capable of contributing to extractors that are, highly technical Python projects specialized in, for example, pulling data out of Salesforce or Google Analytics or Facebook ads or what have you. So we reached the conclusion that in order to make this eventual future in which there was a single end-to-end tool that teams could get started with, built only out of open source components, for that to be a reality, we really had to start at the beginning of the journey, which is data integration. And the interesting thing is that we realized that in the open source space, there exist a number of really great open source tools that kind of sit at the end of the data lifecycle. So think of BI and analytics tools like Redash, Metabase, or Apache Superset, and then which you can connect with a data warehouse, and then you get going from there. And there exists really great open source transformation tooling as well, specifically dbt, with its dbt models, which analytics engineers who are capable of SQL are, obviously for great reason getting really excited about these days to transform their data. But then the first step in the pipeline where you're actually getting your data out of a data source and piping it into a data warehouse, we realized that there were some open source projects that have kind of attempted to make a dent here and to try to offer something that could really serve as an alternative to some of these proprietary tools and hosted tools out there. But today, in large part because I think these hosted proprietary ELT and data integration platforms have such great data source and data warehouse support, both in quantity and in quality. A lot of companies out there, even if they do use open source technology in the transformation or the BI analytics stage, or if they were interested in putting together an open data stack that is completely based on open source components, including something like Airflow for the orchestration, the actual data integration bit, most companies that don't have the resources to actually build and maintain all of these extractors themselves would end up opting, for very understandable reasons, for one of these paid hosted proprietary tools, where of course you pay some money upfront or I guess in most cases on a subscription basis or a usage basis. And then of course you give all of the burden of both maintaining and building these extractors, as well as the burden of actually keeping these pipelines running stably in a production environment. You leave that over to this other party. So we realized that the place where the Meltano end-to-end story would really kind of have to start is in that integration bit, because no one is going to switch to a full open source end-to-end data lifecycle tool unless its data integration chops are competitive with what people can find in paid and proprietary tools out there. So the decision was made to, for the time being, start focusing specifically on turning Meltano into a really great and truly competitive open source alternative to these proprietary ELT pipelines out there, with the kind of greater ideological goal being to make the power of data integration available to all by building this true open source alternative. Because right now, the data integration space has essentially become pay to play, where unless you actually have the resources in-house to build and maintain these extractors and all of this tooling for running and orchestrating these pipelines yourself, you are almost forced to go with one of the paid options out there, which means that to a large portion of the companies out there in the world who would benefit from doing something more with their data, they are currently not actually able on making progress on that goal or on that ideal until they have figured out the data integration step, which usually now means paying for it. So we realized that there was a great opportunity in the open source data space, not on the analytics or BI front specifically, because like I mentioned, there's a number of tools that already fill that need. On the data transformation stage, the same is the case, but on the data integration space, we felt that is really where the open source data story kind of falls apart, because for most companies today, the open source tooling available in the space just isn't sufficient and cannot truly compete with the paid options out there. So the history of Meltano is that back in March, we pivoted very specifically to the ELT side of things. And that's what we've been trying to get under the attention of the public over the last 2 months or so. And a month ago, we officially announced that new direction with a blog post. And that is also what sparked my reaching out to you over Twitter and my being on this podcast today. So I'd love to talk more, in the duration of this interview about this future direction and what this means and where we can find contribution from people.
Yeah, that's definitely, as you said, one of the biggest challenges is once you have the data, then it's generally fairly specific to the organization and the questions that you're asking as to what you do with it. But getting a hold of the data in the first place, as you said, is one of the challenges because of the fact that there are so many different sources and the number of sources is generally growing at any given time for any given organization. And also, as those data sources evolve and mature themselves, the specifics of how to integrate with them or the format of the data that they're producing is going to evolve, which means ongoing maintenance, because you can't just write the integration once and then not have to touch it again. You have to make sure to stay up to date with all of the representations and all of the available options for what that source data set is able to provide to you. And as you mentioned, one of the projects that you are working on using to help bootstrap your work is the Singer project that already has some library of taps and targets for being able to pull that data out and load it into some destination. But I also know that the overall community around that solution is a bit of a sort of patchwork. There's not really any sort of cohesive aspect to it. And so I'm wondering, in your efforts to build this open source data integration platform, what are you seeing as the primary strengths of Singer as an option and the benefits of using that as your basis going forward? And what are some of the shortcomings that exist either in the community or technological aspects of it that you're trying to improve or work around in the work that you're doing at Meltano?
Yeah, great question. And that's exactly where I wanted to go with this next. So like you mentioned, the Singer ecosystem. So Meltano data integration, of course, starts with extracting and loading. So you need an extractor and a loader. You need a tool that manages pulling the data out of a data source, and then another tool that manages pushing the data into a data warehouse or another file format or whatever it might be. And Singer is a specification that describes how to write scripts that can take that role of extractor and loader. And specifically what the Singer specification does is describe a format for the intermediary, format that the Singer extractor outputs, and that then serves as input to the Singer target. So ultimately, the Singer specification is not much more than a description of how the tap and target can really communicate. Like, what is the format that this extracted data should be in at the intermediary step that then any arbitrary target can take as input for it to convert that into the correct, insert statements or whatever you would have in order to load that data into a data warehouse. So a project like Meltano and data integration platform always starts with, like, how are we going to write these extractors and loaders? So when Meltano was originally started and the GitLab team started looking into building its extractors and its loaders for the data sources that we ourselves wanted to connect with, we of course looked around to see what formats and what options and what libraries of existing taps and targets, or rather extractors and loaders, already existed, and we came across Singer pretty quickly. And the interesting thing about Singer is that it is essentially, it was built by Stitch specifically. And Stitch is one of these hosted ELT platforms that we think that Meltano will be able to compete with one day. And Stitch founded the Singer specification to allow Stitch users, as well as data engineering consultancies that serve Stitch users, to build extractors for data sources that Stitch did not support yet, that could then be kind of plugged into the Stitch system once they had passed some review process. So what you see if you look at the current dictionary or library of Singer taps and targets is that they exist for a good number of data sources, but especially those for which Stitch doesn't have native out-of-the-box support just yet. And this is very powerful because, like you mentioned, of course, new SaaS services are popping up every day, and there are various regions around the world where the most popular SaaS tools might not be the same ones that a US company is likely to use. So it's really great that Stitch allows their users to kind of build these plugins that allow data to be extracted from sources that weren't previously supported. And because Singer has this kind of existing community around it of both users who are trying to build the steps and targets for use with Stitch, as well as data engineers and data consultancies that are building these for use by their customers, we saw it as the most promising open source ecosystem of extractors and loaders today. And another advantage is that it's all written in Python, which is of course the de facto language of data engineers today as well. There are some alternative, open source ELT specifications and sets of extractors and loaders that have been written in languages like Ruby, but obviously that was a downside from the perspective of wanting to make it really easy for actual data engineers to get started with maintaining these, which is why we picked Singer at GitLab originally. But since Singer was originally founded and still explicitly kind of is primarily intended to be used with the Stitch platform, the Singer taps and targets by themselves don't get you the data pipeline that you would actually be comfortable running in production. So a couple of things that we have found are currently lacking in the Singer ecosystem are, first of all, kind of a really great story about once you found a Singer tap and a Singer target, an extractor and a loader for the data source and data warehouse that you're trying to use, how do you actually turn this into a data pipeline that you would be comfortable running in production and not having to double check every day to make sure that it didn't didn't break down, because at the lowest level, Singer taps and targets are just single executables that take a couple of flags and that use standard in and standard out to output and input data in following the Singer specification. So you need some kind of runner tool around that can actually keep track of piping these together in a reliable way, managing the configuration, both the tap and the target. So you should think about credentials or other configuration options, as well as managing the state of the pipeline, so that when the pipeline is run a second time, it starts off where the first run left off. So the Singer ecosystem, a couple of these different runners currently exist, and you can run these locally and they work just fine. But then if you want to deploy these into production, you have to figure out yourself how you're going to orchestrate them. Fortunately, of course, Airflow supports a bash operator, which allows you to just call out to one of these runners, and then every orchestration platform or workflow management system supports bash scripts or commands in a similar way, but it still requires quite a lot of manual setup work. So as I said in the beginning, the idea was that Meltano would provide the glue around the open source components it would consist of. So from day one, Meltano kind of started filling in this glue and turned itself into a runner for Singer taps and targets. But once you have a runner that takes care of configuration and entity selection and state management, you still actually want to run this in production. So if you're comfortable deploying Airflow or deploying Luigi or deploying Prefect or what have you, then you should already be able to use Singer taps and targets with one of these existing runners or with Meltano as a runner. But this still means that the learning curve and the barrier to entry is pretty high if you compare this to someone who can just go, for example, to stitch.com, sign up, immediately be presented with a dashboard, with all of the logos of the supported data sources, click a connect button, enter some credentials, and then have your pipeline running there and be confident that you can just kind of forget about it and you'll be notified if something breaks. And for the most part, you can expect that the platform will kind of fix it itself, especially if it turned out that the data source changed in a way that made the extractor incompatible with a party like Stitch. You can, of course, assume that they will have the resources to fix that. So then even if your pipeline fails, it will stop failing and it'll work again on the next iteration, the next interval tick. And currently in the open source Singer ecosystem, this tooling around running them and deploying them and monitoring them and actually being able to say, hey, I set this up once and now I'll deploy it and I won't have to worry about it again, that doesn't really exist. So a big barrier to entry there is that if you actually want to use an open source and free data pipeline, you have to figure a lot of this stuff out yourself. And again, Meltano is trying to make that a lot easier by providing this tooling and glue that makes it that simple to set up a Singer-based data pipeline that can have an optional transformation step using a DBT model, and then also orchestrating this on top of a supported orchestrator like Airflow and deploying it using, for example, a Docker file, which I'm actually working on right now. So this is one of the barriers to entry to the Singer ecosystem. Another one is the fact that the Singer taps that have been created are very, they're varying in quality and in maintenance and in feature completeness relative to the proprietary data connectors that you might find at a paid hosted vendor. And part of the reason for this, of course, is the fact that, well, like I said before, for really understandable reasons, most companies, even if they at some point explore using an open source ELT platform, they understandably would usually decide to just go with one of the paid vendors anyway, because you don't necessarily want to take on that burden of maintaining the data source extractors and loaders that you need all by yourself. So a lot of these, even if they've been written once and they work, they are not necessarily used as frequently or in production for them to actually be maintained to the level that you can get started with them today and actually get a great quality out of them. And part of the reason for that is also that if you actually use Singer taps with Stitch, you're of course less inclined to build a Singer tap for a data source that Stitch already supports out of the box. And since Stitch's own extractors and loaders are not actually open source, that means that there are more Singer taps that are kind of in niche markets and in local markets, while all of the popular tools are served by Stitch, but not necessarily by Singer taps, because there just hasn't been as much of a motivation to build those, because again, most people using Singer are probably using it with Stitch. And at that point, why would you build a Singer tap if the Stitch extractor already exists? And the same kind of goes for Singer targets, because If you use Singer taps with Stitch, it's actually still Stitch that is responsible for loading this data into your data warehouse, which means that the Singer targets that exist have all been written by people who do want to run Singer taps outside of the Stitch ecosystem, while Stitch itself hasn't been particularly motivated to support those because, of course, at that point, you're kind of competing with the hosted offering that they offer. So they are not inclined to build this tooling around the Singer ecosystem because in a way, they would be empowering the open source community to not need them as much anymore. And so this is a couple of things. Like I mentioned, the data, the quality and the quantity of Singer taps and targets is currently a barrier to entry for new users. The lack of tooling or the lack of a great deployment strategy is a barrier to entry. And then there's also the fact that building Singer taps and targets today is not as easy as it could be, or really as we would want it to be, or as it should be. Because while there exists a lot of documentation around the Singer specification, and there exists, of course, a number of Singer taps that are all open source, and you can find their repos on GitHub and review their code, there doesn't exist a kind of cohesive set of best practices or a boilerplate or templated system almost of how to get started with a tap that will be feature complete and robust and reliable and ready for production. And right now, building your own tap is very much a matter of reviewing 5, 6, 7 different taps, taking the best bits from all of them and then trying to piece it together yourself. So additionally, there is opportunity in providing better tooling around actually building and maintaining and testing taps and targets, which will, of course, increase people's confidence in their own data pipelines. Because today, as good as Meltano could be as a runner and deployment platform for Singer taps and targets, ultimately the quality of your Singer-based ELT pipeline is only going to be as good as the specific tap and target that you're using. So we see big opportunity too in building more tooling and documentation, and perhaps util libraries that go beyond what is currently available to make it easier for people to set up a Singer tap for a new SaaS API they want to include in their data project. And these are all things that various parties, various of these data consultants I've been referring to that are already using Singer taps, and some of them also Singer targets and pipelines. Some of them have open sourced some of the tooling they're running themselves, but none of them have gone so far as building an entire kind of suite of tools to really make this as easy to use and get started with and keep using as the proprietary hosted options out there. And that is exactly the gap that we want to fill, because by empowering the existing Singer community, the Singer ecosystem can really start living up to its potential. And once it does, in combination with the Meltano platform to actually run and build and deploy them, you will end up in a place where companies that are currently not doing anything with their data at all, because for whatever reason they might not be able to afford one of the hosted options, or there might be like legal reasons, like for example GDPR in Europe or HIPAA in the US if you're dealing with health information, which preclude them from using one of the hosted tools, using any but, for example, their highest tier subscription levels, which actually do come with things like HIPAA compliance or GDPR compliance in case you want these to be hosted in Europe. So we want to get to a place where through building Meltano, we empower the existing Singer community to the extent that the Singer ecosystem grows to a place where, in combination with the Meltano tools, even people who are not currently familiar with Singer and who are not even comfortable writing or maintaining Python taps and targets themselves will be able to come here, find something really easy to deploy and get started with, a great set of data sources and warehouses supported out of the box, so that they can really get started with Meltano, while it might have taken them another 6 months or another funding round or another 1 or 2 data hires before they would otherwise have been able to get started doing anything with their data. And that's why very explicitly it's kind of about empowering people to start doing more with their data and turning this tooling into a commodity so that every company can benefit from these doing something with their data to the extent that they currently can't.
Today's episode of the Data Engineering Podcast is sponsored by Datadog, a SaaS-based monitoring and analytics platform for cloud-scale infrastructure, applications, logs, and more. Datadog uses machine learning-based algorithms to detect errors and anomalies across your entire stack, which reduces the time it takes to detect and address outages and helps promote collaboration between data engineering, operations, and the rest of the company. Go to dataengineeringpodcast.com/Datadog today to start your free 14-day trial. And if you start a trial and install Datadog's agent, they'll send you a free t-shirt. And I want to dig a bit more into the specifics of the actual Singer specification and the fact that it uses standard out and standard in as the transfer mechanism. But before we get to that, I want to dig a bit more into the focus that you have currently in terms of the target audience that you are working with and trying to cater to in the current incarnation of Meltano as you ramp up to the point of being more generally applicable, and how that particular focus is informing or constraining the architectural and design decisions that you are making as you build Meltano and its current implementation?
Yeah, great question. And like you said, it's very important to stress that the target audience of Meltano today is different than what it might be 6 months from now, and that's different from what it might be a couple of years from now. But today, we are specifically targeting data engineers who are already familiar with and comfortable with, or at least exposed to Singer taps and targets. We are specifically targeting people who are already in the Singer community and part of the ecosystem, because these are the people that we can get the most relevant feedback from at this point, because these are the people who either are already running Singer tap and target based pipelines in production based on their own kind of hand-rolled setup, and these are the people actually building these Singer taps and targets either for their own usage or for their clients in case of consultancies. So these are the people who can at this point give us most feedback to kind of make Meltano the go-to tool for building, running, and orchestrating ELT pipelines built out of Singer taps, that says on the homepage, because these are the people who are already doing it without Meltano, and we want to, with all of their feedback, make Meltano the tool that they actually want to use going forward for their own, and then that will of course empower more people too, because then the Meltano tool will be heavily informed by people who have actually already done this. So if that describes you, dear listener, then definitely check out Meltano. If you are the second kind of people we're interested in this point are those who have already found out that they are interested in running open source data integration. Data engineers who are comfortable, working with open source projects, that are comfortable working with beta quality projects in some sense, people who won't necessarily be looking for a massive amount of support, and that are excited to build this with us, who have already decided they want open source data pipelines, but they might not necessarily be familiar with Singer yet. And these are the people who we want to show that because of Meltano, Singer is kind of the best possible option right now for them if they want to deploy a pipeline like this, because these are the people who at the next stage will start using, first of all, the existing Singer taps and targets that exist, but then would also be comfortable potentially contributing to them if they find bugs that they want to fix, or to build new ones for taps and targets for data sources that are not currently supported. And these people we're attracting are right now mostly smaller companies who, for, like I mentioned earlier, whatever reason, are not currently part of the market that is addressed by these paid and proprietary tools for a myriad of reasons. But we are seeing quite a lot of interest from developing countries, for example, where, of course, local income and local prices they can charge for their products are, in a lot of cases, far lower than what is common in the US, which also automatically means that US tools are often out of reach for these companies. So they are more interested in open source. And after that, once these data engineers have really gotten the Singer ecosystem to a place where the quality and quantity of data sources starts getting closer and closer to what the proprietary hosted platforms can offer today, then little by little, the target audience of Meltano will start growing in the upward direction, where even people who are currently paying will start wondering, why am I actually paying for this if this Meltano thing seems pretty robust and seems to be able to do all the same stuff I'm currently paying for. And at that point, of course, there will still be companies who are looking for 24/7 support, or looking for all of the various things you get with proprietary vendor. But I can also see a future in which GitLab or other parties will start offering a hosted version of Meltano, which will then hopefully still be cheaper and more extensible than the other platforms out there today, because we do kind of build on this community supported ecosystem of tap and targets. And just kind of to take this question one step further, the ultimate future I see is one in which writing taps and targets or extractors and loaders will no longer be a responsibility specifically of data engineering teams or data engineering tools, but I can see a future in which Meltano data pipelines and specifically Singer taps will be as much of an open source standard that specific SaaS providers, especially newcomers onto the market, will themselves author their own official Singer tab. And in the same way, you'll see data warehouses shipping their own Singer targets, because it allows them to immediately plug into the data projects and data pipelines of all of these users of Meltano and Singer. While right now, a newcomer like this into the market would need to wait for one of the big hosted parties to either decide to allocate resources themselves to building it, which will take a while, chances are, after the founding of that project originally, or it might be that a customer will need to pay for them to be able to include that new SaaS API or SaaS tool in their data integration story. So the future, and what this means is that today, if you are entering a market in which a lot of SaaS tools already exist that are widely supported by data integration platforms, you are at a significant disadvantage as a newcomer, because many of your prospective customers who you would want to switch away from what they're currently using will not do so if what they're currently using is supported by the data integration platform, but what you want them to switch to, your new tool or your new data warehouse, is not yet. So in the future, I don't think we'll be depending as much on the individual community members or data engineers to build this integration. I think we'll see this being almost a given, that any company that wants to be part of people's data pipelines will themselves have an official tab or an official target, which ultimately helps everyone, including the end user, because everyone using Meltano or anyone else using a Singer compatible data integration platform will be able to connect with all of these data sources and data warehouses from day one without ever having to worry about the quality of the individual tab or target or what to do if a bug occurs, because you can expect that this will be part of the expected offering of the actual SaaS provider you're using. So that's kind of where we want to go in terms of target audience. But today, we're targeting specifically people already part of the Singer community, because today Meltano is primarily a Singer tab and target running and deployment and orchestration platform.
And digging into the specifics of how Meltano is implemented in its current incarnation, I'm wondering if you can just describe the overall architecture and some of the ways that it has evolved from the original direction, where it was trying to be this all-encompassing tool that included the entirety of the lifecycle.
Yeah, so since in the beginning, we knew that while we wanted Meltano to be a convention over configuration tool where, most people would just be able to get started without having to tweak too much, we did recognize that not everyone would want to use every part of Meltano. Like Meltano, the 7 letters in the word Meltano actually stand for model, extract, load, transform, analyze, notebook, and orchestrate, because that was kind of the wider end-to-end vision we had in mind at the time. But we knew that we were not going to be able to convince everyone to go and use all of Meltano at once. So architecturally, Meltano starts with the concept of plugins and extractors and loaders and transformations, but also transformers like dbt and orchestrators like Airflow to Meltano are all plugins. And ultimately, your Meltano project, which is the single source of truth for your data project and your data pipelines, has a Meltano.yaml file, which collects the various plugins that you've plugged in, which are kind of just dependencies that point at either a specific PyPy package or a Git repo URL that contains a Python package. So because of this plugin-based approach, the pivot in terms of, okay, we're going to focus only on ELT for the time being and not on these other steps that have to do with analysis and notebooking, etc., only really meant that we wouldn't stress those other plugins anymore, because if you're using Meltano with only extract, load, and transform plugins, even in the previous iteration, it would basically already be the exact ELT tool that we have today. So that plugin-based approach means that Meltano is very much pick and choose, and you don't need to use all of it. You can use it as a simple Singer tab and target runner. You can use it as a Singer, as a pipeline runner if you also want to take dbt transformations into that. And you can use it as a system to kind of abstract away the orchestration layer if you're comfortable only using pipelines consisting of EL and T steps that just need to be run on a schedule. So actually the original architecture of making this very much pick and choose and plugin based allowed us to pivot relatively easily to focus on only a specific part of that whole story. And someone using Meltano today if they don't dig deep into the documentation, will never know that it can actually do a couple other things that we are now, for the moment, explicitly not stressing. But we have also not removed these things from Meltano either, because if we do find a user who is motivated and inspired enough, like, hey, it would be cool if Meltano also did basic point and click and analytics, we want this developer to the site, this contributor to the site, to start contributing into that direction and then making that part of it more powerful, because we do see Meltano very much evolving into the direction where the community takes us. So it doesn't necessarily need to be exactly what GitLab had in mind from the beginning, and it's very likely that we will be spending months and months or years and years just focusing on ELT. But just like we saw with GitLab, there is power in allowing people to go beyond the standard functionality it offers today and add some extra features that they would want. But it's very much up to the community to see where it goes. And fortunately, the plugin-based architecture allows for that really easily. And just as an example of the power of that, right now, Singer taps and targets to Meltano are just extractor and loader plugins that happen to use the Stinger runner. So hypothetically, theoretically, if another extractor or loading framework comes up that people start asking us to support, or if an alternative to DBT becomes popular, it is doable to allow to add a new transformer plugin type or a new extractor loader plugin type to Meltano, which will allow us to move in that direction. Because again, we want to be the glue between these different tools, more so than lock people into a specific set of tools. And the idea is very much that the Meltano project is your data project, where your data engineer, analytics engineer, analysts, etc. work from. And we want to be able to evolve with data teams as they decide to move different tools over time. And what we've seen recently is that we started out supporting specifically the Airflow orchestrator, which means that if you are using Meltano and you want to start orchestrating, or in this case, running on a schedule, your pipelines, it's really easy to add Airflow as kind of the backend orchestrator implementation. But because this is also plugin based, it's relatively straightforward to add support for another orchestrator like Prefect or Luigi. So that again, it's up to individual data teams what they prefer, what they already have experience with, or what they want to plug it into that they already have deployed. And Meltano makes it really easy to specify the different tools that your project consists of and how those are tied together, more so than it locking you in any specific combination of tools. And that architectural pattern is very much what has allowed us to pivot as easily as we do. And it's pretty crucial to the future that we see with Meltano basically outliving the specific open source tools that are in vogue today that people might come towards. So I think it's less likely that we'll ever move away from Singer taps and targets, because obviously we are also investing in making that ecosystem more, having the ecosystem grow and empowering the community. But on the front of orchestration, you're already seeing that Airflow is not necessarily losing popularity, but projects like Prefect are being considered by a lot of new teams over Airflow because, of course, these tools also evolve with the data space. And hopefully Meltano will be able to evolve with the data space as well.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate the pluggable aspect of Meltano and being able to replace the orchestrator, as you said, with something like Prefect or Dagster, and the fact that the Singer taps and targets are able to be built and iterated on in isolation without having to worry about how they hook into the overall ecosystem or the specifics of Meltano. And digging more into the Singer specification, I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the challenges that you and your users are facing when going from that easy on-ramp of, I can run this locally on my machine, I can get data out of this service, and then I can pipe it into this other service by just using the pipe operator in Bash, and some of the complexities of scaling those and deploying them into production and monitoring their execution and their overall health, and some of the ways that you are looking to address that within Meltano.
Yeah, great. So the Singer specification itself, we have so far not really considered changing. I think a lot of the power, in the sense that we think it is currently, it serves the needs of data engineers, it serves the needs of what you would expect from a specification that allows a data pipeline like this. And of course, from our side, there's a lot of value in explicitly starting out, not wanting to change the specification, because right now we are not at all in a position where we can do something as a kind of decisive like that. And our power is very much in trying to become the go-to runner for Singer-based pipelines, etc. What we have found is that on the side of specific taps and targets, there is a lot that teams can do to actually improve those to be more, ready for scale and etc. And a group of people who have done a really great amount of work there are TransferWise, a UK-based, I think, startup that have recently published PipelineWise, which is their own runner for Singer taps and targets, which comes with their own forks of a number of taps and targets as well. And they are spending a lot of time making these targets for, Snowflake, Postgres, and BigQuery really great and feature complete and ready for production. And there's still a lot of opportunity there. And like I mentioned, what we want to do with Meltano is at some point also empower people to actually build taps and targets that are just as robust as the ones that, TransferWise and some other data teams out there are currently building. On the front of the Singer specification so far, I think it provides enough for us to be able to build this platform on top of it. Of course, Singer taps and targets, or rather Singer taps, are already being run in production by Stitch. And they were, of course, built to serve the needs that they have for plugging it into their existing infrastructure and having them kind of compete with the, extractors that they natively support, for some definition of native that I don't think are actually written using the Singer specification. So the Singer specification is fine. But I think where people really, run into trouble when they try to deploy these is just because there are a number of moving parts. Like you have the configuration to Singer taps and targets that needs to be provided in a config.json file, which can be passed in a flag to the actual executable. But of course, this configuration file will contain a mix of, standard, Boolean configuration values, but it will also contain the credentials used to connect to either the SaaS service or the data warehouse. So if you want to deploy a Singer tap or target into production, you got to figure out, okay, how am I going to separately manage these sensitive secrets from these settings that I'm fine having checked into a Git repo somewhere. And that's not currently addressed by Singer specification or the tooling provided around it. Similarly, a Singer tap, when it runs, updates an internal state dictionary to kind of say, how far have we progressed with syncing data from this data source. And then the state file at the end of the data pipeline, it needs to be saved and then passed on to the tap in the next incantation so that it starts off where it left off. But if you want to run Singer taps in production and you only have a tap and a target, two little, pipeable executables, you yourself have to kind of set up the infrastructure around it to manage this state. And then there's also entity selection. If you have a data source that supports a lot of different entities and properties, a lot of different tables and columns, the way that you tell a Singer tap to only actually sync a subset of that is by providing a catalog file. And a catalog file describes the entire schema, and then it can select specific entities and properties. But generating this catalog file today means that you have to either completely manually generate it based on the specific entities and properties you're looking for, or you can invoke the discovery mode, which is implemented by a lot of taps, which literally just means running the tap as you normally would with -- discover as a flag, which will result in the tap actually outputting or generating a catalog.json file, which by default selects every single attribute or a subset of attributes. And then the process of actually informing the tap when you truly run it in sync mode to only extract a subset of these entities and properties means modifying that JSON file that is generated by discovery mode to only select or add the selected :true property to the specific properties you want to extract, which again, literally is kind of a manual process right now, which might involve modifying a massive JSON file, which is of course very error prone. So Meltano also helps out with that by adding some commands that make it easier to specify in a declarative rule-based way which entities and properties you're actually looking for, so that this catalog file can be automatically generated and passed to Meltano. For configuration, we do something similar in which Meltano has different configuration layers. Environment variables, first of all, kind of following the 12-factor app principle of environment variables being kind of the go-to way of exposing sensitive or environment-specific configuration to your application. And then there's another configuration layer, which is the actual config object inside your project Meltano.yaml file, which you can use for non-sensitive configuration. And there's one or two more options there based on your preferences and your setup. And on the front of managing the status the state of these steps and targets that is really the state of the pipeline, Meltano manages the pipeline for you. And it has this concept of scheduled pipelines. And it knows that for each of these scheduled pipelines, it needs to store the state and reuse it on the next invocation. So this is a kind of functionality that is relatively basic in a Singer runner, a runner of Singer taps and targets. And a number of these runners exist, like I mentioned before, because Singer taps and targets are used by various data consultants and teams in production at their clients or in their own teams data stacks. But then you still got to go one step further, which means you actually want to deploy this pipelines onto either your own cloud or a VM somewhere, or it could be Kubernetes, or maybe you want a Helm chart to make it really easy to deploy this. And we really want to get to a place where someone doesn't need to know that running Singer taps and targets means dealing with state and configuration and entity selection. We want to make these simply configurable plugins into the Meltano platform, and Meltano manages everything else for you, both in managing these various aspects of each Singer tap, target, and pipeline, and in actually making it really easy to deploy these onto production. So in terms of the runner tooling that manages, like I said, state config and entity selection, a number of tools already exist, but none of these have gone so far as trying to abstract away these kind of aspects of Singer taps and targets. And we can afford to abstract that away by allowing users to interact with extractor and loader plugins, just like they would with other Meltano plugins, like the Airflow Orchestrator, like the dbt transformer, which means that as a Meltano user, the way you configure any of these different plugins is as identical, whether that's through environment variables or through the Meltano config CLI or through the config object in your Meltano.yaml file. So we want to intentionally kind of abstract away the Singer and tap and the Singer specification specifics, because ultimately we think it confuses data teams that just want to get stuff done more than it actually helps them to expose those underlying bits of what makes a Singer tap or target a Singer tap or target.
And in your experience of taking over this team and working with Meltano and helping to understand the direction to take and actually building out the platform, what have you found to be some of the most interesting or unexpected or challenging lessons that you've learned in the process?
I mean, the most unexpected lesson for me really was that, when I came into the position that back in March, where I kind of need to figure out where to take Meltano from here, like what is the best bet for the next couple months or the next 6 months or whatever, because obviously from GitLab's perspective, Meltano is an R&D project and it's been invested in for 2 years, but we do expect, of course, some results at the end, at least in user uptake and an actual increase in contributions. And unfortunately, we hadn't seen much of that over the last 2 years. While there had been some initial interest and some people have been giving us feedback over the last 2 years, very few people had actually converted into users and contributors. So I ended up in a position where I kind of need to figure out how to change that, where to go from here. And at that point, like I mentioned earlier, back in March, I very much wasn't read up on the state of the data space and the state of ELT tooling and how Meltano fits into the needs of the data engineering community, and specifically the open source minded data engineering community. So one thing I was just kind of really fortunate to find is that almost unknowingly, by building this Singer runner for ourselves, almost unknowingly, we had built something that I came to the conclusion through talking to some of these Singer community members was actually something they were really looking for and waiting for. And a lot of people expressed with us that while they had been able to kind of get out of the ecosystem, the Singer ecosystem, what they needed up to that point, they did feel that the potential of the community and the ecosystem was far larger than what was being realized today. And that had a lot to do with lacking tooling and documentation. So I was just really fortunate to find that, of course, because we, as the Meltano team, decided to build something that made it easier to build Singer taps and targets, it turned out over time that we had actually that whole time been building the exact thing that the Singer ecosystem had already come to the conclusion that they needed to go further and grow. So I was happy to find that we hadn't gone completely in the wrong direction, building an end-to-end platform that no one wanted, or betting on some open source technology that was actually, falling out of favor and out of popularity. But I found within a couple of weeks since starting to think about, okay, where to go from here, and then talking to these Singer ecosystem data engineers, that Meltano actually resonated a lot with these people when explained in these terms of let's build a true open source alternative for the data integration problem. More so than when it was described as let's build an end-to-end platform for the data lifecycle and for data teams. And we still believe, that there is value in this end-to-end story in the future. And I would love to kind of see the community take it there and develop it into that direction if that is where we decide, we can bring value. But I was just very happy to see that what we've done so far, even if it didn't pay off immediately, is paying off massively now, because we built something that has really hit a nerve over the last month. And the response that I've gotten from Singer community members and data consultancies that are using Singer taps and targets or evaluating using Singer taps and targets in the data stacks that they offer to their end users, all of them, all of them have spoken to us, which is a good amount of the ones that are in the community, have been really excited to not just use it and try it out and give us feedback, but also actually build it and make it happen with us. I would never have expected, for example, that within 2 weeks after our kind of announcing the new direction for Meltano and the new focus for Meltano, a company called Applied Labs already reached out and said that they are planning to replace PipelineWise, which, like I mentioned, is another Singer pipeline runner. They're planning to replace it with Meltano in Applied Data, which is the data platform, the integrated data platform that they offer to their clients, because they see the value that will come from not just focusing on building a tool that can run Singer taps and targets, but also a tool that provides the UI around it that can be used to treat these pipelines just like you would a pipeline in a tool like Stitch, where you just have a UI and you click your connector and you configure it and you hit the start button and then you check it, on a schedule to see if the monitoring, if the graphs and everything still looks good. We want to develop Meltano into that same direction because today it's most appropriate for data engineers who are highly technical, but we want to get it to the place where everyone can start using Meltano really easily. And they see the value, and they have actually committed to putting 1.5 engineers on the Meltano project for the next 2 months, specifically to focus on building out this data pipeline management user interface, which we already have in a basic form in Meltano right now if you run the Meltano UI command. But explicitly, I've been focusing on the CLI and deployment story over the last month or so. But it's been really great and kind of confirming of what we're trying to do here, to see that community members are already starting to contribute, not just a couple of hours a week when they feel like it, but people who actually believe in this vision just as much as we do, want to make it happen, and are putting their money where their mouth is and working with us on making that data pipeline UI a reality. And that will definitely be part of making a Meltano that can truly compete with hosted options out there a reality, because we know that not all of these users that we want to target, especially the less technical ones at smaller startups, we know these are not necessarily going to be comfortable running CLIs locally or managing and deploying their own project, using a Docker file. So I've been really heartened to see that we're not alone, and we seem to really have hit a nerve. And I could never have predicted that a month and a half ago when I was kind of faced with where to go from here, and kind of all of the options seemed equally good and bad. But I'm glad that with the help of some of these data engineers I've talked to, we've really been able to build something that we are really all excited about together, and that we're going to try and make and realize together. Because our intention is for Meltano to not be another tool built by GitLab that's going to try to get some users out of the GitLab community. We really want to build a tool for the data engineering community with the data engineering community. And that's playing out exactly as I hope it would a month ago.
Are there any other aspects of your work on Meltano or the overall space of data integration, or some of the challenges in an end-to-end tool for managing the data lifecycle that we didn't discuss that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
No, I think we've covered pretty much all of it. And I very explicitly don't want to talk too much about the end-to-end vision for today, because even though it's still kind of in the back of my mind as an eventual future in which I could see Meltano developing, it will really be up to the community that we attract. And I want to build something great with the community. And so far, it seems we're doing that. So we've covered it all. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk about the project and and reach a broader audience. And I hope that people in the audience who hear some things that might be relevant to them will check out Meltano, give us some feedback. And even if today it might be quite far from something you would actually consider deploying into production, if you give us that feedback, know that I will continue to work 40 hours a week to make it a reality. And like I mentioned, people are starting to step up who are going to be investing significant time as well. So even if today Meltano is not quite what you were expecting it to be, check it out a month ago from now or 6 months and see where we go and then try to get us there with your help. Let's build this together.
Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow along with the work that you're doing or contribute to the project, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And as a final question, I would just like to get your perspective on what you see as being the biggest gap in the tooling or technology that's available for data management today.
I mean, my answer can only really be one thing, which is the gap is in the lack of a true open source and solution even existing in this space. I think you could never call a market or a space saturated until there is an open source equivalent that can actually rival the paid offerings out there, especially if this is a space where most of the end users or a good amount of the end users are themselves actually programmers perfectly capable of coming together and building something like this if we actually combine our forces. So in the data management space and in the data integration space, I think there's a massive opportunity to kind of disrupt it from the bottom with open source technology, and we can do it together. And otherwise, great data integration tools exist. I'm not claiming that is nothing out there today if you want to integrate your data. But as long as there's not something open source, so as long as there's not something free and truly open and accessible to everyone out there, then a significant part of the market, it is as if there were no tool at all. And that is what I think is the biggest gap in the space today, the lack of open source solutions.
Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and discuss the work that you're doing on Meltano. It's definitely a very interesting project and one that I intend to keep a close eye on and possibly employ for my own data platform uses. So thank you for all of the time and effort you've put into that and the rest of your team as well. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. You too, Tobias. Thank you so much.
Listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, podcast.init, at pythonpodcast.com to learn about the Python language, its community, and the innovative ways it is being used. And visit the site at dataengineeringpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. If you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts at dataengineeringpodcast.com with your story. And to help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.